All right, folks. Well, welcome to Translating Inclusion, Instructional Strategies from the In-Person Classroom to Online Learning Environments. Our presenter is Christy Jersin Woods, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christy so that she can give you guys an awesome presentation here. So I'll be in the background sort of monitoring things and managing Zoom. So here you go, Christy. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session. I want to start off, I know Jesse already mentioned my name, but I want to start off just with some brief introductions. I actually have a co-presenter who's unfortunately really sick and she's not able to make it, but so much of this presentation is her research. So I want to make sure that she is getting all of the credit where credit is due. So Dr. Colleen Smith is a freelance instructional designer and consultant at her own company. And she also just recently defended her dissertation. So she is now Dr. Smith and will be graduating at the end of this semester with her EDD in Learning, Design, and Performance Technologies from Florida State. And then, hello everyone, my name is Christy Jersin Woods. I am an instructional design manager at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I have an MED in educational leadership and a graduate certificate in ed tech for adult learners from Northern Arizona University. I will do my best. Dr. Smith, Colleen, has left some amazing notes for me on her sections and her research, but know that this is not my dissertation, it is Colleen's, and I'm going to do my best to share out and do her research justice. But thank you all for being here today. And as Jesse mentioned, feel free to ask questions in the chat, feel free to come off mute. Happy to make this as collaborative as possible. Okay, so like true instructional designers that we are, wanted to start off the session with some learning objectives for today. By the end of the session, we hope to translate instructional practices that are meant for in-person to online environments appropriately, making sure that those are inclusive. We want to examine the CSID model, which is a culturally sustaining instructional design model, as a tool for guiding inclusive instructional strategies, knowing that one instructional strategy does not make an inclusive environment. And so how do we do that as much as possible? And then together, we'll collaborate on a document of inclusion instructional strategies for online learning. That is imperative in this work, is to really hear from the lived experiences of others. And so I think it's incredibly important that you all get a chance to share out some ideas as well. So let's start with an introduction into what inclusion instructional strategies are and why they matter to our students. There's really two main components to inclusion instructional strategies. The first of which is that they aim to promote full and active participation for all students, all learners, regardless of identity, ability, disability, race, ethnicity, gender, any other characteristic that you can imagine. We want to make sure that we're inclusive of all diverse learners. And then the second really goal of inclusion strategies is to create a learning environment that is accessible and supportive of all students, and really helping them and enabling them to reach their full potential. So there's no barriers that come across that would inhibit students from reaching their full potential, both in and outside of the online learning environment. So why do inclusion instructional strategies matter? Well, they are important because they promote a more equitable and just educational system. We'll get into some further research down the line, but the educational system has not always been a just place. And by creating a learning environment that is accessible, supportive of all students, regardless of their identity, their background, or abilities, inclusion strategies really help to reduce those barriers and promote academic success. So what that means for stakeholders at your colleges, at your institutions, at your universities, is that inclusion strategies matter because they increase student retention. So students that start your programs, that are admitted to your programs, actually finish them. In addition to this, inclusion strategies can also help to foster a sense of belonging. And this is huge because this not only impacts student success and retention, helping them to actually graduate, but it also can improve their overall well-being and social emotional development. And this is not just for K through 12. This is for higher ed and beyond. So this is every learner at every stage. I really love this quote from Dr. Micah Estrada, who is a social psychologist at the University of California, San Francisco. In this research study, Dr. Estrada looked at the inclusion strategy of kindness and microaffirmations. You've probably heard of microaggressions, which are the subtle ways of making people feel excluded and discriminating and stereotyping. Microaffirmations, on the other side, are these subtle ways of making people feel included and increasing senses of belonging. And what she found was paramount. So I want to read this quote for you. The research evidence strongly supports that the hypothesis that academic environments that foster kindness cues affirming social inclusion, potentially creating microclimates and cultures that warm up institutional environments for diverse students in STEM educational environments. And her research was specifically on STEM students, which can often be kind of a whitewashed program. So simply put, inclusion strategies, instructional strategies like kindness, increase belongingness, and belongingness creates cultures where all students, diverse students, thrive in and outside of the learning environment. So they're super duper important. We've talked a little bit about what they are, why they're important, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into this, especially as we introduce the model and the framework to talk a little further. But I just want to share a few examples of inclusion instructional strategies that you may or may not see faculty bring into the classroom. You, if you teach, may or may not bring into the classroom yourself, both in the in-person classroom and the online. So instructional strategies that are inclusive can take many forms. If you've ever worked in K through 12, you've probably heard of differentiated instruction, which is essentially accommodations, adjusting your teaching style and content to meet the diverse learner needs of students. If you've ever worked with folks who need accommodations or need disability support services, you've probably worked with assistive technology. That use of technology, again, is used to help support students with disabilities and learning difficulties. Some even like more solid examples of those names. So encouraging students and your faculty yourselves to not only learn the correct pronunciation of your students' names, but then also to use one another's names to build that foundation of community. That's one example. Representation, so deliberately choosing course content that's representative of a range of students. In this case, I'm using the example of physical abilities. So are you choosing course images, research articles, other course materials that include and represent folks with disabilities? How do you know that you're doing that? How are you making that intentional? That's something to keep in mind. And UDL. UDL gets brought up a lot, definitely in K-12, but then in higher ed, I think it's starting to kind of pick up pace of really utilizing methods for multiple methods, a variety of methods for students to have voice and choice. So students get to demonstrate what they know, they get to engage with the content in the way that works best for them. So are you giving your students that voice and choice in how they're demonstrating their learning? As an example of one inclusive strategy. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what inclusion instructional strategies may include. It's important to note, and I think when Colleen and I were writing up this presentation, we wanted to state over and over again, so you'll hear me say this, one inclusive strategy does not an inclusive environment make. It's not just asking students to pronounce their names correctly and utilizing names. It's not just having course content that's representative of diverse students. It's all of these little things that kind of add up to create this environment. So next we'll explore a model to help dive deeper into this framework.
Hey, Christy.
Yeah.
Just to say I think some people are having trouble viewing the whole screen.
Oh.
Maybe, is there some way you can full screen your presentation?
I can get rid of my bookmarks. Let's see if that helps. Does that help?
I'm not sure because I'm seeing the whole thing. I just got a message that some people are only seeing
Part of it.
part of it. Yeah.
I think maybe it was the quote at the very bottom. This is just the citation, and I'll be sure to share out my presentation slides in the Discord at the end of it. So if there's anything that you feel like you missed, I think you're seeing the entire screen.
Okay. All right.
On this side. Oh, it looks like some people see it all too.
Okay,
so,
people are seeing it. Okay, great.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry to
thanks,
interrupt.
Jesse.
Yeah.
No, great. I'm glad that you did. Thank you for doing that, and thanks for the folks confirming that they can see it. And if you can't, again, I'll be sure to share the slides in the Discord back channel, so then you'll have access to those as well. Okay. And actually, that was perfect timing, Jesse, because transitioning now into the CSID model. So we've begun to explore inclusion instructional strategies. Now I'd like to introduce a framework for integrating inclusion into learning environments called the culturally sustaining instructional design model, or the CSID model. And again, this is really based a lot on Colleen's dissertation research. So I want to just put credit where credit's due. She's done a ton of great research in this area. I'd like to start off by reading this quote. The basics, obviously when we design online courses, we are not separated from our culture, our backgrounds, our beliefs, values, and teaching, or our experiences are reflected in our design. So the basics in this research and this model is that we can't separate ourselves from our worldview. And when we design an online learning environments, those things come out, whether we like them to or not. So this is important, and really even the foundation as we get into the CSID model, or the culturally sustaining instructional design model. Before I actually show you the model, this isn't necessarily a model that you can just pick up and use. You have to actually kind of set some intentions and prepare to use the CSID model, or really any systemic process that is geared at creating inclusion in online environments. So we wanted to share some, advice to help you prepare to use the CSID model. So anybody that's wanting to use this, the person reflecting on how to use this model should reflect on also on how to create an inclusive learning environment and take these steps. So the first is that we have to learn from the past to design for the future. The historic foundation of higher education was created to serve only wealthy white male students. And as we think about higher ed, especially as it started as this ivory tower, these exclusionary practices can still be felt throughout the system of higher ed today. So as we know, that the higher ed system can create and reinforce and maintain social inequality and biases by promoting these cultural practices from the dominant view. These historic norms mean that intentionally taking learners' backgrounds and cultures into consideration is especially important to support the learning of all students, because the idea is that we want to mitigate perpetuating the dominant view. Instructional designers need to be intentional and search for and implement more equitable ways to design the inclusion space. And this is not a passive stance. You have to be very intentional in that inclusion space. Next, we must identify and reflect on our own biases. It's not just the norms of higher ed that we need to pay attention to in this broader systemic issue of being exclusionary. We also have to look within ourselves to realize that we all have personal biases. We all have a way that we view the world, and it's being carried into and throughout our design and development process. We have to have this critical self-awareness in order to think differently than the dominant norms and choose to consider both the learners' diverse cultures and increasingly variety of distinct learning environments, such as going from in-person to the online. It's only with the foundation understanding of our own biases that we can then become further aware of other people and how complex they may be. So no one person holds just a single identity. And you may have heard of the term intersectionality. We all have different levels of positionality. We all navigate systems within ourselves as our identities intersect and change across context and over time. So these intersectional identities involve overlapping social understandings and positions that can be both empowering but also oppressive. So we need to reflect as instructional designers on our own intersectional identities and positionality and how as those identities and positionality experience privilege or oppression within the online environments. And these experiences then inform our design decisions and then the decisions moving forward. Lastly, we've got to use models that help us design for learners' diverse backgrounds and experiences and needs. Like many models outside of instructional design, these models and frameworks have been created by designers from the majority culture, or they are culture agnostic. You may have heard the term color blindness. And like the systems of higher education, that means that they have the potential to preserve and reinforce historical dominant norms that may exclude some of our learners. So we need to use models that really help to make sure that all of our learners' diverse backgrounds and needs are represented. So with that in mind, and with these preparation techniques, we can then prepare to create an inclusion online learning environment using these strategies rather than just implementing one inclusive strategy, again, because one strategy does not create an inclusive learning environment. Okay, so here is the CSID model, which combines the culturally sustaining pedagogy model with the integrated multicultural instructional design model. Sorry, my dog just barked. It's displayed as an unfolded pyramid with a square base and 4 triangle sides. The base is the community of post-secondary scholars, practitioners, learners, their communities, essentially community. The right triangle side is content, so what we learn, what we teach. The bottom triangle side is how we demonstrate what we've learned, how we assess learning. The left triangle side is how we learn and how we teach pedagogy, and then the top side is how we access student support services and how we support learning. And I'm gonna let my dog in, she's gonna keep barking, so sorry. Bella. And naturally, as soon as I went to let her in, she walked away. Each side of the pyramid comes with a list of bulleted prompts to help conceptualize the model and translate it into practice. I'll be sharing a Miro board that we'll collaborate on that has those bulleted lists and prompts to help you kind of put that into practice. But for now, it's a little easier to remember the different sides of this model if we give it a one-word name. So support, content, demonstrate, and pedagogy, and knowing that the base is really that community. This tool can be used during the design phase of an instructional design process like ADDIE, and it is a system to reflect on and think through the different subjective and objective domains when designing an inclusive online learning environment. Faculty can use this, administration can use this, instructional designers can use this to really design inclusive online learning environments. We're going to come back to this in just a minute when we go to collaborate, but this is kind of the framework that we're utilizing for the rest of the presentation. We also want to build in some research on inclusion practices because most research focuses largely on face-to-face learning environments, and there's a need for identifying best practices in the online learning environment. And what we've seen through the research is there's this steady progression of different types of research going from K-12 to higher ed and then to online learning. And we see the same progression with inclusion happening. The online learning seems to be the last to adapt that and integrate inclusion instructional strategies. So we want to kind of give some feedback there and some context to the research as well. The most popular strategies to create inclusive learning environments are contextualized by GAY's culturally responsive teaching. You may or may not have heard of that term before, but these principles were actually originally meant for elementary and secondary school levels. Again, we see it starting in K-12 and moving into higher ed and now into online learning. And Lark actually was a researcher that addressed that culturally responsive strategies should actually be implemented into higher ed as well, especially strategies like revising your syllabus, designing lessons based on culturally responsive pedagogy, engaging students by connecting assignments to their lives, and redefining assessment. We've also seen Woodley focus on describing best practices for teaching within the culturally responsive pedagogy framework in online environments. Some of these practices included really just validating students' pre-existing knowledge, providing some multidimensional learning opportunities, and meeting synchronously for students in that online environment. So it's, begun to start, but we're not quite there yet. And then there's actually a collegial critique of culturally responsive pedagogy, which basically recommended that multicultural educational research continue to include things like multicultural elements, maintain cultural relevance and responsiveness, and move towards affirming and sustaining culture and the heritage of students through those different pedagogies. So it's important to remember, again, that one inclusive instructional strategy does not create effective learning environments for all diverse students. Instead, if you can be intentional and design a set of instructional strategies, media, and tools selected that reinforce this values-driven pedagogy, that is what increases the level of effectiveness for diverse students. But again, unfortunately, we've seen that research not only focuses on in-person environments more often, but it also has a tendency to focus on accessibility only in learning environments rather than the design of culturally sustaining approaches to meet the needs. So this means that many design and learning strategies may be called inclusive, but what there actually are is accessible, which is great. Accessibility is incredibly important, but they're also not necessarily, or maybe leaving out unintentionally, a growing population of culturally diverse students that enter online education. So why do we think there's a gap in this research on inclusion strategies? Well, we think there's also a variety of barriers to implementing it in the practitioner space. Implementing inclusion online and then training faculty to implement inclusion instructional strategies effectively can be really challenging for a few different reasons. There may be all kinds of barriers that come up, and it can be challenging, again, for several different reasons. The first of which is that many faculty may start off with not having prior training or experience in inclusion instructional strategies. So they may not fully understand or have a limited understanding of the best principles and best practices involved. This means that they'll probably have a lack of confidence or competence in that, and so they'll be less likely to implement these strategies. What's more, taking it from the in-person classroom to the online space is that those two learning environments are not the same. They don't equal one-to-one. What you do in the classroom, you may or may not be able to do in an online learning environment. And those can be things like giving lectures, communicating with students, instructor presence. All of these things are a little bit different. And because of that, you also have varying levels of expertise. So faculty may have varying levels of expertise with technology and online learning platforms. Especially for folks who've only taught in person or have only developed courses in person and now are developing and teaching for online, they may not have ever used that technology or an LMS. And so they're interested in creating choice, for example, as a UDL strategy, but they aren't sure how to implement this in like an LMS like Canvas. So some faculty members may require more intensive training and support than others to really implement inclusion instructional strategies in the online environment. In addition to that, there is often limited time and resources for faculty, and that may create a huge barrier, resistance to change, especially because some of these things are time consuming. Making sure your videos are captioned if you don't necessarily have a captioning resource may make it so that faculty are like, no way, I'm not doing that. I didn't have to do that in person. And so they may be resistant to change or prefer traditional teaching methods. So you may need to convince faculty a little bit of the benefits of inclusion instructional strategies. You may also need to convince your stakeholders as instructional designers, your leadership, your executive leadership, and that may require ongoing support and encouragement to implement these strategies effectively. To illustrate this point a little further, I want to show a couple of examples that are the same but different, some of these best practices for online inclusion. So we know, and especially in the online space, that there is this really big importance for regular communication with students. And there's also this large focus on strategies for building relationships with students online. So as far as regular communication goes, if you're in person in a classroom setting, student to instructor communications happens regularly when they're in the classroom. Maybe it's in office hours if your students attend those. And it can happen pretty organic, that you don't have to go out of your way. You've got these time commitments that you're expected to be there as an instructor, and the student's expected to be there too. But online, you can actually forget to communicate with your students. Your students can forget to communicate with you or with each other. So you have to be a lot more intentional about the regular communication and what are the strategies to build that. For building relationships, it's the same thing. It's pretty organic in the classroom. Who do you sit next to? Do you come early so you can talk to the professor? Do you stay late so you can talk to the professor? Those, again, office hours, those things kind of happen a little bit more organically. It's not as difficult to do in person as it is online. Certainly doesn't mean that there aren't challenges in person as well. There definitely are everywhere you go. But overall, the successful implementation of these inclusion instructional strategies requires is ongoing training, support, and collaboration between faculty and instructional designers, and this willingness to adapt and modify strategies that would work in person, but just don't quite work the same online to meet the needs of the people in your class. So I have a Miro activity, but before I go there, I want to pause because I know I've basically just been talking to you for the last 30 minutes and you've only heard my voice. So I want to give a chance for questions, thoughts thus far before we step into the collaboration activity. If anyone wants to unmute or ask questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. And I'm going to drink some water. Okay, looks like no questions. Great. If you have questions, again, feel free to add them to the chat. So I have a Miro board. I'm actually going to share that with you. Jesse, if you don't mind putting the links in the chat, that would be great. This Miro board is kind of twofold. The top is that CSID model. And it has the different areas that we talked about. So the base, pedagogy, demonstration, support, content. It also has those bulleted lists to kind of help translate that into actionable strategies. Then at the bottom, it has each of those areas, base, pedagogy, content, demonstrate and support, and then the area for questions to brainstorm together what strategies might look like. So to start on this, go ahead and read through the CSID model again and its prompts, help you brainstorm. And then I'm going to give you all some time to add to each of the sections by selecting these Post-its. So you can select this and copy it or just write directly into it. If you need to add more Post-its, they're over here on the left-hand side. You can add sticky notes. But go ahead and add to each of the sections and we'll work on this quietly. I think probably a few minutes. I do see a question that came up, so I want to answer that. And then I'd like for us to split into small groups since there's so many of us, just to be able to brainstorm some strategies. If you need help brainstorming some ideas and strategies, Jesse, I gave you one more link if you have the link still. There's a resource for inclusion practices in teaching and learning that was adapted from Center for Research on Learning and Teaching that Jesse's going to put in the chat for me. Feel free to use that as a brainstorming as well. But I'll just give people a chance to work on this. And then I do see a question. Oh, thank you, Jesse. So that link is now in the chat if you have it. And I'm actually going to stop sharing this right now, or stop sharing that Miro board specifically and give people a chance to work on it, and then we'll come back and look at it together. Okay, I do see a question in the chat from, I believe it's Amy, and I apologize if I'm saying your name incorrectly. If you have a chance to unmute and tell me, that would be great.
It's Tiny.
Tiny, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Tiny, you mentioned that your model requires reflection, which is always a good thing. What might be some questions that we can use to begin or drive our own reflection? This is a good question. I've done a couple of activities around like implicit bias through the implicit association test, which is based out of Harvard. If you haven't heard of it, they're essentially these tests that you can take that will kind of see if you have any implicit bias for different identities and categories. And that is a great way just to get some awareness to see if you do have this implicit reaction. I think that's a good place to start because sometimes it's really hard to admit that we have bias. It's such a charged thing, emotionally charged thing. You don't want to admit that you have it, but everybody has bias. And that's a good place to start. I actually have, I wish I had thought of this question ahead of time, because I have some resources to me that talk about like reflecting on your positionality and who you are and some of those pieces. So maybe in the Discord, I'll share that out as well, just like an opportunity to reflect on it. Essentially, you just want to look at like what your identities are, what your privilege is, and how that might mean that you look at the world a little bit differently. For instance, I do not have a physical disability. So when I see things like being able to cross the road and having a ramp up the sidewalk, I don't think about those things because I don't necessarily need it. It's not part of my worldview. But somebody that has a physical disability, they might notice those things and really take care to make sure that that is intentional with that. So that would be like an area that I would want to make sure I'm really intentional about, because it's not part of my like worldview as my identity manifests. So I will definitely share. I have a positionality statement document that I'll share in the Discord chat afterwards. I'm going to write that down because I will forget. Great question. Okay. I'm just going to check in here. Looks like we're still needing a little bit of time to kind of review. So it's easier to read. Looks like we got some folks in here. So I say let's give it like 2 more minutes, and then Jesse, if we can do some small breakout rooms for folks to be able to brainstorm and put something together on the Miro board, just to give people a chance to kind of communicate with each other in that way too, that would be great.
Yeah, how many breakout rooms would you like?
If possible, I'd like to have it between like 2 to 4 people in a room.
Yep.
And then let's just give it like a 5-minute. Actually, let's do 4 minutes, and then we'll have time to talk afterwards.
I'll set that up. Just let me know when you want to move people to the rooms.
Okay, I'm gonna give folks just a minute left to get a chance to write some things in here. And again, if you are needing some ideas, some brainstorming, there is a resource in the chat that was adapted from the Young Center of Research on Learning and Teaching that has some ideas that you could potentially borrow and put into there too. Just if you want to go ahead and move folks into the breakout room, that would be cool. So while you're in the breakout room, just make sure that you are at least adding 1 sticky note onto this Miro board, collaborate on some of your ideas, and we'll give you a few minutes and then bring you back and share out as a group. Okay. Everyone, it looks like everyone's coming back now. Thank you all. I see some folks purposely working still. No worries. So I want to take a moment to share out some strategies that I see that have come up. So if you'd like to unmute and share what your group wrote on any one of these, I would love some volunteers.
And Christy, we're at the 5-minute mark.
Thank you. Or you can write in the chat too, if you would prefer.
Well, I didn't end up writing anything on the board because we spent more time just talking about our idea and we didn't get around to it before the thing ended. But we ended up talking about technology and how, like, for example, this board, we spent a while just trying to figure out what to do and how with our students, we have to kind of give a basis and understand that people are coming from different technical backgrounds and have access to different types of technology. And like somebody's doing this class on their phone, are they going to be able to participate in this activity? Things like that.
For sure. Yeah, great point. And thanks for the reminder too, Erin. I really appreciate it. If you wanted to, and anyone that was with Erin and Erin's group wanted to add that sticky after the fact, this Miro board's still going to be open. So please continue to add to it. Great points, Erin. I see some other ones, like choosing readings that reflect the diversity of contributors and authors in the field. Yes, absolutely. Students are supposed to ask questions, but that is cultural. Yeah, great points. Providing ways for students to reflect in a modality that they're comfortable with, language and dialect. Erin, I see you right in the technology one. Excellent. And then it looks like some folks. Yeah, okay, great. Great. Well, know that this is available and open to you after this session. It doesn't have to be just the thing that you use right now. Feel free to continue to add to it. Like I said, I'll be sharing resources in the Discord afterwards, but I wanted to give a moment. We have 3 minutes left. So I'll one say thank you all for listening to me essentially lecture at you for an hour. I hope it was helpful. But two, do you have any questions, anything that I can answer for you while we still have a few minutes left? Yes, we will definitely add the reflection. Thanks, Jenny. Great. Well, if there are no questions, I'll hang out for the 2 minutes, but thank you all again. And I really appreciate getting to share this with you. And thank you again, big thank you to Dr. Colleen Smith, whose research is largely this. So thank you for all her research and her work. She's been great.